Hello, everybody. I am going to walk you through how to create the cognitive toolbox. I'll give you some of the ideas behind the list of recommendations. Cancer-related cognitive impairment is very prevalent. About 50% of breast cancer patients complain of it post-chemotherapy, and about 15 to 25% of those individuals test as having cognitive problems. Yet we know that this is an issue just of what is termed chemo brain, because we can actually identify that 30% of people who have benign or low-grade brain tumors are impaired even pre-treatment. And as treatment progressed in those individuals in which there was a baseline, 88% of them remained the same as at baseline at 3, 6, and 12 months post-therapy. So the issues regarding cognitive change in cancer are complex and not just related to treatment. So we know, though, that subjective complaints matter. Even the first inkling of concern is something that we really need to pay attention to. We need objective tests both before and after so that we can identify what domains of thinking are involved. And we know that there's a lot of variation in the severity and duration of change in different cognitive domains. It can be during, just after chemo, occurring late and delayed. Sometimes symptoms persist for a long time, and other times it improves over time. And we know many other factors influence thinking beyond cognition alone, and that is mood, fatigue, and sleep. Of great importance to us is knowing about those factors that make the brain more resilient or plastic, and how we can actually build compensatory reserves. Now, in talking about cognition, we're going to focus on a brain unit called the dendrite, and this just means little tree. And I was curious about this term little tree, particularly after I read this book, The Hidden Life of Trees. I've always thought of trees and forests as sort of magical places, and from a very long time, the idea that trees could talk, and there was sort of an aliveness in them was something that intrigued me. And I discovered in this book by Peter Wohlleben that trees actually have communication systems. They identify their own and nurture them. They have memory systems. So I became very curious if this idea of dendrites in the brain had more than a superficial resemblance to trees. And it turns out that the brain math fits the same tree math. The same math models of growth and connection of trees fit exactly how the units that make up the brain grow and change. So in the brain, we have nerve cells that link end to end. We have long axons in the white matter, and then terminal tree-like branching structures called gray matter. And the brain grows by adding more ramifications. These are the dendrites, or little trees. These are protein connections between different neurons. And this is the essence of what we're going to be focused on in terms of what happens during cancer-related cognitive impairment and how we can grow more of these dendrites and preserve them. As we look at how we develop in life, you can see from being a newborn through adolescence and adulthood that we grow many more connections. And even though the maximum rate of this growth is about 8 months and then levels off, this process continues, we know, actually throughout all of our lives, even in the presence of other brain pathologies that might be destroying connections. But we also know that building this connectivity is really important early in life, that early learning is key for brain health. And the importance of connections is because we don't really grow new brain cells. If we look at newborns, they have a lot of these, and in this picture here, a lot of these lime green connections. These are new brain cells. But then when you look at age 13 and 35, you see hardly any. New neurons decrease with age, and we don't really create new ones. So we really have to be focused on the connections or dendrites and in keeping our old neurons healthy. And probably this idea that we don't grow new neurons is important because we're a very long-lived species, and there's more of an advantage to preserve learned behavior in the connective networks for stability. And if we continuously added new nerves, they would not be able to hold the memories of past experiences. Memory itself is the product of both a pruning and kind of a padding mechanism. We actually have an excess of linkages from neuron to neuron. There's about 10,000 connections or synapses for each neuron. And when we are learning something, we have uneven cell growth. Some neurons grow faster and bigger than others, and larger cells then are pruned to resemble other cells. This redundancy allows for resilience. The more dendrites a neuron starts with, the more flexibility it has to prune back exactly the right branches. So throughout life, we're looking at the balance between synapse growth and synapse destruction. And here is a preparation of individual neurons and their dendritic trees, and the color coding for what's new and what's been eliminated. So here we see new branches added. Here we have some pruned, and here we have both pruned and added branches. So we know this process is ongoing in our brain throughout our lives. Our biological focus then is to maintain dendrites. And how do we do that? It turns out that we harness an internal mechanism called autoimmunity and inflammation. Autoimmunity is often seen as a bad thing, a process in which our own body attacks itself, but it actually is part of the normal toolbox that we have for clearing dead and dying cells. And it's done through the process of creating proteins called antibodies. And it turns out we're born with these antibodies. They're not transferred by mothers. They're already directed against a particular set of proteins or antigens that are normal. And they are involved in the pruning and remodeling process that underlies learning. And here's an example of these antibodies attacking the normal cells in our brain. Another important principle to understand in thinking is that it is done through the combined efforts of groups of cells and their connections called networks. So for a moment, let's just kind of imagine the brain as one big tinker toy. And here is an individual unit of the brain. Here's the nerve cell with its extension called an axon. And then throughout life, what we're adding are these orange sticks, the dendrites. And these dendrites are made up of a protein amyloid. You may be familiar with this protein in the context of Alzheimer's disease when it goes rogue, but amyloid is a very important part of normal brain processes. It is actually the protein that makes up those links that underlie memory. And then if we imagine that we have lots of links between cells and lots of dendrites, we are creating this huge tinker toy construction. Underneath the organization of these tinker toys is a way that the brain communicates by dividing up the work. So if you look at this map of in Holland, I can't pronounce the names of all these, but you'll see the names of individual neighborhoods and how they're clustered around Old Center or downtown. And notice that in the neighborhoods, the streets are very short and very dense, and each one has its own kind of local color, and then they are connected each one to the other by expressways, and that they all lead to the Old Center. This is exactly what happens in our brain. We have sections of the network involved in analysis of individual processes, such as all the processes needed for vision, all the processes needed for language, all the processes needed for movement. And then after we've heavily analyzed what we see or hear or what we want to do, we can then share that information and combine it with other parts of the brain, so that we can actually coordinate and do a task. So that is, this means that the brain has areas where there's lots of short connections that would take a long time to get through, just like the local streets. And then we have these pathways designed for speedy transport with lots of information traveling there together towards a center where everything is coordinated. In addition to the networks themselves, the physical connections, we have chemical messengers, and they are important for our understanding of how the brain works. One of the one of these chemical messengers is acetylcholine. This is a chemical messenger that gives us the signal to receive information, to be alert and aware. And it is involved in coordinating our senses, which make sense of the world and give us a sense of self. The next chemical messenger is one that helps with action. Actually, two of them, adrenaline and dopamine. And they're involved in motivation, fight or flight, and reward underlying the things that we do. And then finally, we have the chemical messenger serotonin, which gives the message of feel. It underlies our emotions, also the things that are important for maintaining us, feeding, management of stress, and coordination of hormone responses. Finally, the networks in the brain are all specialized. We have what's called the default network because it's the one that runs by default. Whenever we're just kind of sitting and not really doing anything very active, this is the network that is functional. And it's actually the one that is functional most of our life. About 60% of our life, we're basically in this default mode. This is the network that underlies what I call the know what. What's going on in the world. And how we know what's going on in the world is information that we gain from our senses. And that helps us make sense of the world around us and also our sense of self. It helps us make records of our experiences in a diary called long-term memory. Then we have a network that helps us know how to do something. And the kind of memory that supports this network is a mental workspace where we can gather information from all different other stores of memory and new information coming in and put it all together in a plan, a goal-directed behavior. And also it helps us understand what to do step by step, keep track of what we're doing while we're doing it, and giving us feedback about how accurate it is. And it is heavily involving visual and spatial mechanisms because actions are done in space. And then finally, we have what's called the salience network, what is in my terms, the know-when network. And this is where we have memory of what's appropriate, when to say something, when to do something. It's social and cultural memory. It helps us mediate our emotions in our actions, helps with impulse control and theory of mind, being aware of what others are thinking and responding to that appropriately. We know that the brain is affected by different kinds of treatments. The area of the brain called the hippocampus, the memory system, is directly affected by cisplatin and 5-fluorouracil. Methotrexate, on the other hand, involves more the white matter part of the brain, the connections, those axons, rather than those gray nerve cell blocks that we saw in our Tinker Toy model. And so that will tell us that if we relate back to the structure, there's going to be different kinds of problems in thinking depending on where in the brain the different chemotherapies act. If they act on a memory nerve cell, we're going to have direct impairment of memory. But if they act like methotrexate on the connections, we're going to see not absence of memory, but slower processing, kind of like removing wires from a cable, which would allow communication to happen more slowly. And we know that other types of chemotherapies affect energy production, the mitochondria, and these are doxorubicin, adriamycin, carmustine, methotrexate, and cyclophosphamide. What connects a lot of the problems underlying cognitive, cancer-related cognitive impairment is inflammation. And so, although there's been a lot of focus on treatment, it's important to know that cancer itself causes problems in thinking, and that treatments are certainly important to know where their actions are, but also who we are in terms of what pre-existing conditions, both good and bad, have happened to our body, are going to underlie what happens to our brain networks and how they play a role in inflammation. We know that there's an excess pruning in the presence of any of these particular factors, and that we will see reduced hippocampal volume and loss of the growth of those dendrites. There are good ones and bad inflammatory factors. The IL-1 beta and IL-6 are bad, and the IL-4 and IL-8 are good. We know that the inflammatory factors vary in terms of their appearance, so that we see different ones in an acute phase than in a chronic phase. And so what we do with them in terms of treating it are going to have to take into account their actions and their timing. When we look at the actions of many of the chemotherapies, we see what they are doing is affecting more the fast transit of information down those expressways on our map. So if you can imagine, then without expressways, you had to travel downtown. You have to go by those surface streets, and how often you'd be stopping, how long it took, how effortful it would be. This is explaining the experience of the outcome of many of the chemotherapy processes on the network we call the executive network. Rather than absence of memory, we get slow processing. We get difficulty concentrating, forgetting in the moment, and trouble multitasking because we have to navigate now through less efficient means. And we have less ability to quickly coordinate all the information from these different neighborhoods so that we can mingle in the downtown and have that cosmopolitan experience. What's really important to know when we're looking at cancer-related cognitive impairment is that we're individual. Networks turn out to be as unique as fingerprints. In fact, they're being used as forensic evidence of what's happening to identify people. We know that what age we are makes a difference in terms of what cancer does to us and what the treatments do to us, because aging changes genes. It overall decreases the factors that promote growth and increase the factors that prune and destroy synapses and dendrites. Genetics affect the structure and maintenance of our brain networks. For example, apolipoprotein E4 has variants that make cognition worse. There are protective factors. One of the inflammatory factors, interleukin 1R1, is protective, whereas another one is going to make our cognition worse because of excess inflammation. There are variants in chemical messengers that will influence the action of networks. One of these for dopamine, called COMT, has a variant that makes cognition worse. And then we have factors that help build networks, and how the variants in these factors are present in our body can help us be protected against the breakdown from cancer and treatments, because it has the capacity to be building our networks and making them resilient. And then there is a concept called cognitive reserve. This is the redundant connections that we have. So if we have excess, we can then have the ability to lose a few more dendrites because of these negative processes on our brain, but still maintain function. So even in the presence of pathology, both cancer and treatment causing problems, we can maintain our thinking because of this excess capacity that we build. So when we're looking at cancer-related cognitive impairment, what we want to do is balance growth times to develop more of the growth-related changes in our brain networks against those that destroy it. And when we look at these individually, what we see is early learning plays a role. So most of us, by the time we have cancer, don't have that opportunity to go back, but it's a factor in helping us be protected. Aerobic activity builds brain. We still benefit from having an enriched sensory environment, because sense is built into that memory system, that network we talked about called the default network. And we're going to see that new learning in particular is important for building a network. Then there are factors that reduce the resiliency of our network. There's stress on the brain. These are vascular factors. They include things like blood pressure, bad cholesterol, high body mass index, and diabetes. Anemia lowers the oxygen supply to our brain. There are both effects directly from cancer and from treatment that make our bloods clot easily, hypercoagulability, and cause little microbleeds that induce inflammation in the brain. Apnea and disturbed sleep, really important. And then the food we eat and how it helps us grow gut microbes are important. Distress and depression are both results of the conditions that we are battling as well as contributions. And then there are the other medicine side effects that we have to take into account, called the anticholinergic drug burden. This is the negative effects of a whole group of medications to reduce acetylcholine, that messenger for the system that underlies memory, and that cancer itself changes our bodies and our brains and can negatively affect it, even independently of treatment. So what we're really looking at in cancer-related cognitive impairment is to balance resistance factors and resilience factors. Resistance factors are things that will help us not develop any pathological change, and resilience is having the capacity to function despite the presence of those pathological changes. And we're going to be looking at growing new brain by the factors we just discussed and reducing the stress on existing brain through mitigating the effects of all those negative factors we talked about a moment ago. What's really important to know is our brain networks are really very plastic. They always are trying to function, even in the presence of things going wrong. And they make workarounds constantly to the point that we're not aware that things are happening to us until the moment that the networks no longer can function. So we have to be aware that sometimes what appears as a sudden effect of a medication or cancer is really the result of a long period of time of change in brain networks, maybe by other things before cancer itself or its treatment even appeared, but they could have been the straw that broke the camel's back. So one of the things that we want to focus on in looking at cancer-related cognitive impairment is preventing the breakdown of this barrier between the blood and the brain, so that there isn't a mingling of things that aren't supposed to. There is a privileged space in the brain. It tries to keep its environment really very static, very provincial, so that we don't have a constant barrage of microbes or other chemicals affecting the very sensitive environment of the brain. The things that break down the blood-brain barrier, however, are all things we can really easily manage. Their blood pressure, the LDL or bad cholesterol, our blood sugar as measured through hemoglobin A1C, our body mass index, and the overall hemoglobin levels, the amount of red blood cells that we have. So we want to keep all of these factors in the normal range as indicated here. The next thing we can do is help prevent the problems having to do with communication from a lack of the chemical messenger system. One of these to be really aware of is the side effect of lowering acetylcholine that occurs with many different medications. When you have this class of medication in your body, you can lower your cognition just by taking these medications. There is an assignment of many medications in terms of the amount of anticholinergic activity it has, and you can sum the effect of all the medicines that you take into what's called an anticholinergic burden score. If that score is greater than 4, you will test as if you have mild cognitive impairment, an early stage of cognitive change. It is also the case, it's not just the medicine you take now, but all these medicines that you take over a lifetime will increase your risk of having a network breakdown. Even when you take one of these drugs that are rated as very high on the anticholinergic burden scale, your risk of cognitive decline is 3 times greater than someone who doesn't. And those of us who are over 65 are most at risk. And this is because so many conditions that we experience as we get older are treated with this class of medication. We also have less overall reserve of acetylcholine and less ability to metabolize these drugs that have anticholinergic effect. The big offenders, I'm going to show you here, are the PM medicines or anything with diphenhydramine or Benadryl, the muscle relaxants, methocarbamol and hydroxyzine. Then any of the sedatives and sleep medications that are under the class we call benzodiazepines. So that's Valium, Ativan, lorazepam, Klonopin. And the bladder medications, oxybutynin and solifenacin. These all have alternatives to them, and you should avoid taking them and ask your physician for alternatives to substitutes for this class of medication. Of real importance is sleep. Sleep turns out to be for the brain. It is takes up 1/3 of our life, and it's so interesting in retrospect to think that something that takes up a third of our life is something we've dismissed for so long and actually bragged about how little we needed. It turns out we need it. And this is when the brain can shut down, not have to be focused on keeping us aware of the environment around us or acting on the environment, and turn its attention towards organizing the information that we've collected during the day. Sleep occurs in different stages, and each stage of sleep has a unique role in helping us consolidate and process different kinds of memory. So this minute of sleep is not the same as the next minute of sleep, and total number of hours of sleep are not as significant a measure of our sleep quality than uninterrupted sleep that allows us to cycle through all these stages multiple times throughout the night. Part of the reason that we need such a pristine environment for sleep has to do with what's going on in the brain during sleep to help us with memory processing. In general, what we see with deeper and deeper stages of sleep is slowing of brain activity and suppression of neuronal activity. During the day, our brains are like Grand Central Station before COVID. During sleep, it's Grand Central Station in COVID times. All we see in the brain during sleep are a lack of activity and suppression of neurons talking with one another, except that in the peaks of these slow waves, we see these little spikes called delta spikes. These are the call-in response of neurons trying to connect with each other. These are neurons that during the day were introduced to form a new memory, but during sleep need an extended conversation in order to make the connection permanent. So this is why our sleep environment has to be so quiet, devoid of any activity or stimulation that would keep the brain from suppressing everything except those connections and activity between these new cells trying to reach out and touch one another. Sleep also has a really, another really important function that we could consider as brainwashing. Sleep is basically also for recovery. There's a stage of sleep called deep sleep, the hardest one to reach, in which this network of channels around nerve cells open up and allow spinal fluid to come in kind of like an ocean tide. And this flushes away the abnormal proteins that build up during the day, and in particular, amyloid protein. As I mentioned earlier, amyloid is what makes up those dendritic connections between cells that underlie memory. But the processing of amyloid creates this toxic cap piece that is cut off and falls into the spinal fluid. During the day, there are millions of these cap pieces, and if we didn't get rid of them and they stick around, they begin to collect into these masses we call amyloid plaques. And amyloid plaques are the first stage of Alzheimer's disease. So it's really important that we have sleep that reaches these deep stages for the purpose of excreting those things that can contribute to other kinds of brain pathologies. So for good sleep, we want to make sure we sleep in a bed. The place that we sleep allows our body to feel like it's a safe place. From an evolutionary perspective, we've never really had, for most of human time, safe brick houses with locks. So the body really got used to the idea that if you slept in one place all the time, that was probably a safe place. So it's why we need to keep the bed for sleep and sleep in a bed. It's important to know that sleeping 7 to 8 hours, no more, no less, is important, that we sleep on the same schedule each day. And if during the day we get sleepy, don't nap more than 20 minutes or you eat into the sleep of the next night and it'll be of poor quality. Alcohol is something that can make us feel relaxed before bed, but it turns out it will keep us in a lighter stage of sleep and prevent us from getting to the deep stages and make us more likely to wake up. The food we eat turns out to be really important in helping maintain our brain health. There is a evidence-based dietary guideline called the MIND guideline. There are 15 items in this guideline, and on average, if you make 9 out of 15 every week, it is associated with improved cognition and prevention of dementia. One of the most important components of this diet is to have a dark green leafy vegetable every day. This is like kale and spinach. And I know that this is often really unpalatable to people, but it turns out that tasting bitter is necessary. Our bodies have evolved to eat these types of greens because they're very high in antioxidants. Of all the foods in this diet, it turns out these have the highest antioxidant potential. And right from the moment that we taste these vegetables, we begin a process that helps lower blood sugar, increase our response to insulin. It activates processes that help help us absorb less fat, increase our metabolism, reduce our cholesterol, and more importantly for all of us in terms of cancer-related cognitive impairment, it reduces the inflammatory markers in the blood. And one way to think about managing this diet is every day to have a salad with a dark green leafy vegetable, another color vegetable, berries on it, a bean like chickpeas or cannellini beans, a handful of nuts, and an olive oil dressing. If you just have that every day, then you've already got 6 out of the 9 points that you need for the week. We kind of tend to focus on eating a lot because that's sort of the fun part, but another part of keeping our brains healthy is aerobics. Aerobics has many different functions that underline brain health. It increases cerebral blood flow. It directly stimulates the dendrites in our brain to expand. It reduces inflammation, that IL-6 that is involved in excess inflammation. And even on the day that we exercise, we will have improved memory performance because of its effect on the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which we said is protective. And aerobics is that activity that helps to activate that protective response. It also reduces our vascular disease and increases the store of antioxidants. From an emotional standpoint, it reduces stress. So how should we do that? It turns out that the importance of exercise is the intensity more than the duration. And from a practical standpoint, that means trying to engage in an exercise in which you may keep up, let's say, walking at a moderate pace, and then every once in a while, take 30 seconds to a minute to do a high intensity type of exercise, like walking as fast as you can. This intermittent high intensity exercise is called HIIT, H-I-I-T. It also turns out that with exercises that emphasize skills and moving in space, like yoga or Tai Chi, that plays a role in increasing the brain. And there is an importance to frequency, so daily, minimum of 5 days a week. And if you do it the same time each day, you are actually setting a body clock that will help prepare you for exercise. For anybody over age 50, it also turns out that exercise will align better with our general metabolism, so that I tell people, go from your pajamas into your gym clothes. And then finally, we talk about the importance of growing new brain and what are those activities that do it. And I think there's a lot of misconception about this, so that people go after computer games or Sudoku or crossword puzzles. But it turns out that human brains are very particular about what they pay attention to. It's almost like the brain has decided, I have a limited capacity, so I'm not going to really pay attention to things that I know, but I am definitely going to pay attention to things that are new and different, because I don't know whether those things are important for my survival or might be a problem that interferes with my survival. So we need to have things that will let the brain know, be a signal that this is something new and different. And it turns out that one of the most important characteristics of an activity is that it instills a sense of awe. Awe, it turns out, is something that we know from a social network standpoint is one of the most powerful kinds of feelings to spread through social networks. And it also turns out to be one of the most powerful inspirations for brain networks to turn on. There was a study just done from a researcher at UCSF in which two groups of people were assigned a walking exercise, just 15 minutes a week. And one group was told, take a selfie before and after and focus in on the walk. The other group was told that you should take a selfie before and after, but during the walk, look for things that are really inspiring to you and interesting, and take a picture of those. And then after the study ended, they looked at these two groups and analyzed them and found that the group that took time to pay attention to the world around them had more intense smiles. As time went on, their selfies turned out to have a smaller face in them with more attention to the environment around them. And we know from a brain standpoint, when people are depressed, that they're focused in on themselves. Even the networks are more hyper-connected, the ones that underlie our sense of self. And that as we recover from depression, we have networks that are more involved in awareness of the world. So this was a sign that depression and stress was being reduced. On scales that measured quality of life, and in particular ones of joy, they were much higher and had more positive emotion. And of importance to us in terms of cancer-related cognitive impairment, it lowered inflammatory markers in the brain. So we want to be engaged in those activities that instill awe. So when we look at how we should organize brain activities, we want to be focused on things that directly feed into that sensory default network that underlies memory. And that means anything that stimulates our senses is important. So art works. We want to really avoid things that are routine or rote or skill-based, like Sudoku or brain games. So that's why they don't feed into this network underlying memory. They feed into the executive network and are not sensory-based. Things that really can be easily introduced are things that have to do with music, the fragrance lavender, on your walk, for exercising, taking time for those pictures. So as we look at cognitive, cancer-related cognitive impairment, what we want to be doing is growing brain and doing things that mitigate the stress on the brain. These are making sure to start an aerobic activity program, engage in activities that enrich your sensory environment and new learning, and in particular, make sure those activities are instilling in you a sense of awe. And then practically look at your medicines, try to talk with your physicians about reducing those that are high in anticholinergic activity. Lower your blood pressure, keep it around 120/80. That doesn't matter what age you are. Look at the bad cholesterol, keep it 70 to 100, but even maybe less than 70. Ideal body weight, less than 25. Hemoglobin A1C, the blood sugar, less than 5.6, and prevent those and try and treat anemia. Look carefully at your sleep habits, and if you're having trouble sleeping, talk to your doctor about an evaluation for sleep apnea. That might underlie your need for that sleep aid in the first place. And then eat those foods high in antioxidants and follow the MIND guideline.